Hi everybody, this is the video for Unit 6, which is about job applications and interviewing, as well as internships and volunteering. And in this video I am also going to follow up on our initial discussion about resumes. Some of you I know are working on those and your first draft is due soon, so I wanted to follow up with a little bit more information about resumes and some of the stuff you've been reading about resumes. But let's start with job applications and interviewing. Again, you're reading stuff for the class that gives you a lot of information about everything I talk about in these videos. So make sure you're going through all the stuff that I have linked in the syllabus and on D2L. There's a lot of really valuable information in there, but I will also pull out some of the key things from what you've been reading. So let's talk a little bit about job applications and interviewing, particularly for those of you who are intending to go directly into the job market after you graduate. A lot of this is pretty self-explanatory, but some of it still bears repeating. When you're applying for a job, you're going to be reading a posting. Those job postings are extremely specific. The folks who are soliciting applications have thought very specifically about what they want to put into that job ad. So follow it to a T. And one of the main things that means is make sure you submit exactly what is requested. Don't add things, unsolicited elements to your job application, but also don't leave anything out, okay? And make sure that the materials that you do submit respond directly to what the job ad says that they are looking for, all right? So highlight your skills and experiences specifically as they are relevant to what is listed in the job ad, right? A lot of what any employer is looking for is a good fit between what they want and what you have to offer. So don't make it a general application, like here's generally who I am, here's generally what I've done. It should be tailored specifically to speak to what the ad has asked for, okay? So make sure that you do that. In terms of interviews, right, with luck, one's initial submission leads to an interview where you're going to actually be able to speak with someone. And that is an opportunity to really fill in things that, for example, a resume and cover letter don't allow you to showcase. So be prepared in the interview not just to repeat what's on your resume, but to be able to add things about yourself and to draw connections that are not as obvious in the materials, the written materials that you've submitted. Being able to do so effectively in an interview means you have to do your homework before you get there. So some of the things that includes is to make sure that you've researched who that employer is. Not necessarily that specific person, although that would be great if you could find out who that person is, what their position is within the organization. But you need to know what's the nature of that company or that organization, what's the history, what's their mission. And you want to also prepare to have good answers to the questions that they ask you. A lot of the questions that are asked in interviews are the same for most interviews. So you can definitely prepare yourself to speak to them. And I'm going to show you some examples of typical interview questions in just a second. You also typically want to bring another copy of, say, your resume or whatever you submitted. Hopefully the interviewer has that right in front of them when they're talking to you, but if for some reason they don't, you're able to also give it to them or to speak specifically to what you put in there. Another final piece of advice on the interview is it's very common for an interviewer to ask you if you have any questions. Always have questions. Think about a way that your question can both inform you more about that organization or company and can highlight who you are. You never want them to say, so do you have any questions for us? You never want to say, nope, I'm good. Always have questions that you want to bring to the table yourself. Okay. So in terms of that homework that I'm saying that you should be doing, here are the things I think you want to be looking for. And most of this is easily answered by sort of basic online search for that organization. You want to know, what does that company or organization do? What services does it provide? What kinds of products does it create? Whatever it may be. What are the company's mission and goals, right? How did they say what their main impetus is for existing? And you need to be able to speak about that in your interview. How big is the organization? How many employees are there? What's the nature of how the work is organized? What kind of a hierarchy would the position that you're applying for fit into? All of these things will allow you to speak with some amount of credibility and knowledge when answering their questions. Is this an organization that just exists in the one office that you're going to visit, or is it something that's multiple branches throughout the US, or is it international? You need to know all of these kinds of things. And all the better if you can speak to some of what this company or organization has on its horizon. Often organizations will post somewhere, including to their website, just information about new initiatives, etc. Read up on anything and everything that you can so that you could mention and speak to some of those, again, those goals, aspirations, anything that's of import to that company or organization. In terms of the job, right? So you want to know about the research, the employer, right? The organization. You want to also know as much as possible about the actual job that you're applying for. Again, a lot of this is contained in the job ad, so make sure you've carefully vetted that and you have that information sort of at your fingertips when you go into an interview. And you can also look more broadly at other job postings for the organization or, or other information you can find online, right, about the nature of the organization. So you certainly want to have a good sense of what the position is, what kinds of tasks are associated with that, that position, what kind of skills do you need to have, do you need to use certain kinds of technology, and can you speak to those? How much do they expect you to have experience or credentials? Do you have those, and or can you speak to how what you do know can fulfill what they're looking for? In terms of questions about sort of how you'll be compensated, different kinds of jobs have different parameters for that. Some kinds of jobs, it's very transparent. It'll say in the job ad, here's the range that we offer for this position. In others, they'll say something like, you know, it's commensurate with your experience. So having a good sense of what the going pay rate is for this kind of position will serve you well. You probably won't get into salary negotiations in this first interview, so you don't need to know it quite to that extent, but you want to have an idea, right? And also an idea of what you think your employment is worth. So you'll be able to have, again, informed conversations about that moving forward. Okay, so here's some common interview questions that you should be prepared to answer for pretty much any job interview you go on. And a lot of these are sort of softballs in the sense that they're asking you, they're trying to provide you an opportunity to highlight your candidacy and what's great about you and all the things you have to offer. But they're only softballs if you've prepared yourself to give a really solid answer. So don't try to wing it. Take this list of questions. You can find other lists of questions online. And prepare an answer. You don't need to memorize it, but you need to be prepared to say those really great points that you can think of when you have some time to actually get it ready, right? You don't want to have to make up your question on the spot. That often will not, you'll forget things, you're nervous, etc. It's hard to give your very best answer if you haven't planned it out a little bit beforehand, okay? So the kinds of questions you're going to encounter. Tell me about yourself. Where you see yourself in 5 years. Why do you want to work here? What sort of skills do you have that you can bring to the job, etc., etc. What are your greatest strengths? What are your greatest weaknesses, right? All those questions that are not terribly hard to answer, but are harder to answer well on the fly, okay? So it behooves you to prepare. At the bottom of the list of questions, I also gave you a link to, it's just an online video about with a little bit of advice about interviewing, which, again, if you're planning to go into interview soon, I encourage you to watch it. We're not going to watch it right this second, but you can go back to the PowerPoint and watch it later. So it's just some advice for exactly how to make a good answer to some of these standard interview questions. Okay, now, If you're going to go directly into the job market, all of that information I've just been giving is applicable to you. For many of you, some of the sort of kinds of jobs that you're interested in getting, it's hard to get it without some kind of experience. And that's where things like internships and volunteer positions come in. So one of the assignments you're going to be working on this week is really thinking about what are some kinds of interning or volunteer positions that I might find that could be relevant to increasing my experience and sort of pumping up my resume for the kinds of paid jobs and career that I ultimately want to pursue. There's a bunch of different ways to find internships or volunteer experiences. You can do many through Northeastern. Many of the major departments on campus have their own internships. So you can also always ask your academic advisor about any internship opportunities within your department, right? And the university more generally often has things that can be taken up by students from any program. You can also find these kinds of positions on your own. And again, I'll show you a couple of examples, but even in our discussion about searching for graduate schools and other kinds of experiences, one of the things I pointed out was there's websites that just list internships. So you can also seek one out, particularly if you're looking for something quite specific. So the main thing to think about is sort of what kind of experience do I want to get from doing an internship or volunteering somewhere, to do it purposefully so that it really adds to your record and becomes something that you can point to as a sign of your ability and your committedness to that field or that area, right? So choose something that will funnel directly into what you want to do in the future so that it can become part of that same path. Here are just a few examples of some sort of higher level internship and volunteer experiences. Some of these are longer term commitments, but for some of you they might be the right thing. The Peace Corps, for example, which is about a 2-year commitment where you're working overseas, you do get a small stipend, but for many folks that's considered really a lot of experience if you want to work internationally and or cross-culturally. You can also teach English abroad. This is another tack that plenty of students take. I've put just one organization here that allows for students to do that over the course of a year. Teach for America and AmeriCorps are both U.S.-based you do get paid, so it's not completely volunteer. But the kind of experience that is really valuable for recent grads who don't yet have a lot of experience in their field, particularly if you're interested in teaching, right, or something that involves teaching. These are other programs that you can pursue, right? Again, these are sort of longer term experiences that I've listed here. There's lots of shorter term experiences through the university or that you can find through looking for local organizations yourself. But whichever way you do it, it can be a really valuable way to get experience in your chosen career fields and to really have something exciting and special to put on your resume that makes you stand out from the crowd. Okay. I want to circle back a little bit now and talk a little bit more about the resumes that you guys are working on. You started by putting together a worksheet or filling in a worksheet with lots of sort of details about your job experience and your educational experience. The idea with this is to use that worksheet to generate material that you can then channel into a resume or a statement of purpose, depending on which direction you're going with that. So I want to talk a little bit more about the resume. Again, I do want to underline, if you haven't already, make sure you read all the materials from the part of the course on resumes. Those websites and other kinds of things that I linked you to have a ton of information. I would say specifically and especially make sure you read the Purdue OWL section on resumes and cover letters and CVs. It has a really a great and very very thorough take on them. And it includes, which I'll show you in a second, sample resumes. So it's one thing to talk about resumes, like it should have this, it should have that, and you need to sort of start with a list of things to add. But I think a resume is as much a sort of a visual presentation of information. So being able to actually look at sample resumes is also really valuable. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. So let's start with a couple of just sort of general points about resumes, and then I'll show you some of those more specific formatting issues. One of the most important things I'd say about a resume or a CV, and again, we've already talked about the difference. A CV is sort of the resume, the version of a resume that's used in academic contexts. So if what you're doing is applying to graduate school for an academic field, or if you ultimately go into an academic position, then what you produce is a CV. For most of you at this stage, what you're producing is a resume, which is shorter, and it's organized a little bit differently, right? It's the much more typically used document. For either of these, but let's assume we're mainly talking about resumes right now. A resume is not a static document, and it's not just a general list of what you've done. A resume is a specific document that's tailored to what you're doing at a moment in time. So you will likely and typically keep a sort of general template, right? Your generic resume, but that's not the one you send out. The generic resume is sort of the basics, and then for each position you want to apply for, you're going to change things to frame that resume to specifically speak to the job or position or internship or school that you're applying to, okay? It's really important to do that because which elements of your record you want to emphasize will depend on what you're applying for, right? So for example, if what you're doing is applying for something where your educational training is one of the most important things that they're looking for, then you may want to put the education section first, right? Or if much of your work is not really relevant to this position you're applying for, but some of the things you've done are, then you might want to come up with a category that specifically highlights the stuff you've done that's relevant to that job and put that at the top, right? So you don't want to have a resume where you have it set up the same way for everything you apply for, which means some of the time, the first things that people are going to see when they look at your resume, they're going to say, well, this has nothing to do with the job, right? Those things on that particular version of the resume should go at the end or should be removed, right? So it's a very specific version of your resume that you want to send out for each thing that you apply for, okay? So you are going to be highlighting your knowledge, your skills, your abilities, but the way you present them will be specific to that moment and that particular application. There are a few different ways to organize your resume, and the Purdue OWL does a really good job of giving you those different scenarios. The most common way is to do it chronologically, meaning in order, right? With a resume, that order is always from the present to the past, meaning in all the categories, educational, job experience, whatever else, start with the current or most recent item and go backwards in time, right? So you don't start with your high school education and then give your associate's degree and then give your bachelor's degree and then give your master's. The first thing you say is, here's where I got my PhD, and you go backward in time, right? And typically once you complete a bachelor's degree, you're not going to talk about anything before that. High school drops off at that point, okay? Same with jobs. You're going to start with the job you're in now, and you're going to go backwards in time, okay? When you're first starting out, you tend to have to include things that are less relevant. Over time, as you gain more experience, you have more things to put on a resume, you'll start to cull out some of the less relevant things, all right? So again, we'll talk in a sec. I'll show you some examples of how those resumes following these different schemes are laid out. Back to the idea that your resume is tailored to a specific position, you want your resume to be basically making a pitch. You want your resume to be persuasive, right? So you're gearing it towards the particular reader that you have in mind, right? It's not just an encyclopedia, like a general compendium of here's all the stuff I've done. It's an argument for you being a strong candidate for a specific position. All right. A resume is typically only 1 to 2 pages long, and a lot of people say it should be 1 page max. CVs are longer, but for many of you, being as concise as possible is going to be crucial. At the top of the slide here are some of the typical sort of organizational categories that are included on a resume. Contact info, of course, is extremely important, typically at the very top of the page. People need to be able to get in touch with you because they want to give you that great job that you just applied for. A resume also then typically has an objective or goal statement at the top where you say, looking for X, Y, and Z. Again, you're going to tailor this. So what you say is your objective or your goal should directly reflect the language from the job ad for the job you're applying for, all right? If you say your goal is something that's not what that job is about, it immediately makes a disjuncture, and the employer is going to wonder why you're applying, okay? The order then after this really depends on the job. Many people put education first, again, starting with the most recent and going back. In that education section, you need to have the formal title of your degree, right? Like BA Anthropology and the year, typically the school. If you have a major and a minor, then you want to include both of those. Depending again on the nature of the job you're applying for, including a very small bullet pointed list of key accomplishments would be a good idea if you did a thesis. If there's any sort of areas of specialty or language skills or anything else that you would briefly want to note, that would be a place to do it. And then the other big category is experience, which can be work experience, both paid and unpaid, and anything else. Calling it experience often is a way to sort of expand that category to include both paid jobs and other kinds of experiential things, like volunteer positions and other kinds of things. Again, depending on the position, some people would put the experience category first and the education experience second. That depends a little bit on what you're doing. It's also common to have a skills section if you have specific skills, like you know a lot of different computer programs, or you have certain kinds of technical skills. If you have multiple languages that you speak, etc. And then finally, honors or awards. Again, anything where you've been sort of singled out for doing excellent work would be another category, quite common to include on a resume. It's also quite common to include references with your resume. Often job ads will ask for references, and so it's fine to list people with their contact information. Make sure your referees know that you are listing them. Ask them if it's okay. It's not the worst thing if you put somebody in there sort of called out of the blue, but definitely a good idea to give people a heads up if you would like to include them as a reference with your resume or as part of an application. For things like graduate school, you don't just ask them to be a referee. You typically ask them to produce a letter. So there's a different kind of negotiation with that. Okay. Now I mentioned, and again, when you look on, here, let me just show this to you now, and then we'll go back to the format. So I mentioned the Purdue OWL, which is in D2OWL, the link to it is. One of the sections of that are the sample resumes, right? So this is something I encourage you to look at because it gives you a sort of an immediate example. So here's, for example, one chronological resume, right? Meaning that it goes in temporal order, right? Objective, education, work experience, right? Part of what these samples also do is start to show you something about how to lay out a resume. The look of the document is important in addition to the content, right? So here's another way of thinking about that layout, which is to think of your resume in quadrants. Part of what you're trying to do is make the page in its entirety really readable, meaning someone can glance through this page really quickly and pick up a whole bunch of information about you. A resume is one of those documents that is made to be skimmed, right? It's made to be read very quickly. anybody who's reading a resume is not just reading one, they're reading 100, right? Or however many there are. So you want to make sure that your resume is like, hopefully all of them, but that yours is readable. That is, someone can glance at it and grab a bunch of information. If it's hard to read, if it's confusing, if your eye darts are all over the place, if it's hard to grab what you're looking at, it will definitely not serve you well, okay? So here are some of the principles. You want it to be very clean, neatly laid out, easily readable font, right? So use one of the standard fonts. It's typically used. Parallelism means for any entry on the resume, you want it to be parallel with all the other resumes, grammatically, right? And in terms of how it's laid out and also grammatically. So if you say, duties, directing employees to do this, cataloging that, organizing this, right? You want those to be parallel parts of speech, right? You don't want to say directing employees to do this, and then the second bullet would be, I organized that, right? It's harder to read when the way that the different units are laid out is different from one another. So you want to always have it be parallel. You want it to be consistent. Quadrants is this idea that you're going to evenly distribute the text across the page. So you don't just have a list of things on the left and a bunch of blank space on the right. You want to have it all sort of spaced out. So one way to think about it is in columns, right? So you'll have sort of the title and then maybe the date on the right, so that people can read across, but they can also sort of see things going from side to side. Another sort of trick for underlining the way that your resume is organized is to use things like underlining, bold, italics, so that the eye is drawn to the categories, right? So you don't want to just have all the same sort of text throughout the whole page. You want to start with a title that's a little bit bigger, or maybe it's bolded, right? So that someone can, again, skip through it with their eye and readily glean all the information without a lot of work. Okay. So the thing that goes with a resume is a cover letter, right? So those of you who are choosing to do a resume are also going to write a cover letter. For this assignment, I encourage you to find an actual job posting that you're going to be applying for, right? You don't have to actually apply for it, although you could, but I want you to direct your resume and cover letter to a specific job posting, not just sort of to a general position. Because I think that will underline the fact that this needs to be tailored. So a cover letter is an even briefer kind of writing than a resume. Definitely no more than a page, usually more like half a page. But you want it to be formal, and you want it to draw attention to the excellence of your application. You definitely want to note what job you're applying for, where you found that job posting, and why it is that they should consider your candidacy, right? This means adding anything that's not part of your resume. Don't just repeat what your resume says, because they're also going to read your resume. But point out something very concisely that makes you an excellent fit for their position and that encourages them to look carefully at your resume. That's really all you're trying to do with the cover letter, right? So it's not an exhaustive discussion of who you are, but it is something that should pique the interest of the employer and encourage them to take a careful look at your resume. Okay, and again, just to underline, please read everything that the Purdue OWL has to say about resumes and check out those samples because it's really sort of all the principles that they discuss in that section in action. So good luck working on those resumes, and I look forward to seeing them this week. Take care. We'll talk soon.